Welcome to the
Club Football Podcast,
where the only question is,
does your team make it into the club?
Can he get in? No, he cannot!
Welcome to another episode of the Club Dub Football Podcast. This week we're going to be reviewing all the highlights from Sunday's Super Bowl, looking at the Hall of Fame class for 2021, and also bringing you up to date with all the NFL news. So now let's go over to JB, PB and Aldrin and get on with the show.
Hey, you already got a ring. It's our turn, bro. We'll see y'all next year.
So welcome, gents. For one more time this season, we get to talk with NFL football in the rearview mirror before we look at, 7 months of barren off-season in front of us. But of all the games to look back at, we, of course, have the Super Bowl. So, Phil, before we get onto your diatribe, I'm going to go around the room and get your thoughts on what we made of the biggest game in sports. And that means, Aldrin, I'm chucking over to you first.
Well, like you say, looking in the rearview mirror, why on earth did any of us doubt Tom Brady? Super Tom was going to carry that team through and bring the Lombardi back to Tampa. But from a neutral perspective, I have to say I was a little bit disappointed. It was so clinical from Tampa. I mean, we were talking earlier about how a game plan just comes together perfectly, and that's certainly what happened for Tampa, but it just felt routine. Clinical's the only way to describe it, because they never really see it. Like we talked about Kansas not getting out of second or third gear a couple of weeks ago, and that's kind of what the Bucs felt like for a lot of the game. They didn't feel up against it. They didn't feel like they had to make any big splash plays or crazy drives. It was easy. I know there was challenges on the offensive line for the Chiefs, and certainly that showed to be probably the most deciding factor for me. It was embarrassing watching Mahomes have to run for goodness knows how many yards for the whole game, trying to avoid pressure.
Something like 427 yards or 400.
Oh yeah, I mean he was significantly over their offensive output in terms of yards in the amount he scrambled. But yeah, just some of the splash plays that Mahomes made on the run was still spectacular. It was just it didn't ever lead to anything, which was a bit of a shame. One of the moments for me is Mahomes scrambling about 30, 40 yards, gets tackled, launches the ball and almost on his side, flinging the ball. And then you realise that he's thrown the ball 50 yards down the field and it still doesn't end up in even a catch or a touchdown. And you just think, well, it's never going to work for them, because if that sort of thing doesn't work, then it's just not happening.
That's a good point, to be fair. I think they had a couple like that. So it was Damian Williams.
Yeah,
where it hit him straight in the face and he dropped it. There's the one, I think it was in either the first or second quarter, where he passed it to Kelsey as Kelsey's getting tackled by Mike Edwards.
Yeah.
And, Kelsey has it in his hands and drops it. And, 99 out of 100 balls this season, he'd have caught that and come down with it and they'd have got the first down. So, yeah, you're right.
I just think it's the pressure that Tampa put on them. That game plan worked perfectly. Todd Bowles had everybody executed perfectly. I don't think there was a single failure on the Tampa team, but equally, they didn't feel like there was any really big splash plays either. There was no big pick six. There was no big turning point of offensive drive. It was just every time they got the ball, they drove down the field and they got it in the end zone. And every time the Chiefs got the ball, they put pressure on Mahomes. It was just efficient.
I think a good example of that point is the Fournette touchdown, the 27-yard touchdown run, where we brought in an additional lineman. So I think Joe Haig came in, and then we brought in Gronk as well, all lined up on the right-hand side of our line. And the Chiefs just didn't adapt to it and didn't change their setup. So the blocking came out. Ali Marpet then runs around from left guard round to the right-hand side. There wasn't a guy within 5 yards of Fournette for the entire 27-yard touchdown run, I don't think so. I think that speaks volumes, and you're absolutely right. It was just perfectly game planned, really, from start to finish.
I would sure hate to be the guy who was on a podcast last week and predicted that it was going to be a 47-45 game. I bet that guy felt really stupid at the end of it. But I think one of the things there about game-changing plays or big plays, I think one of the things that gets lost in a lot of the discussion about how clinical a performance it was by the Bucs is the fact that at 7-3, the Chiefs stopped the Bucs in the red zone, within the 5, on fourth down. Those of us that kind of were on the podcast Zoom call all said this could be the point. This could be where the Chiefs get their mojo working and suddenly we start to see more and more out of them. And it just never happened. A lot of the first quarter from the Bucs felt a lot like a boxer using his jab at the beginning of a fight. It's kind of maintaining distance, measuring it, seeing what happens. And then what's that really good tight end that we've got? Oh, it's Rob Gronkowski. Maybe we should start throwing it to him again. It was almost a collection of the hits. You kind of got everything you'd expect from Brady. Passes to Gronk, passes to Brown. The only person I don't think who was really involved that much was Chris Godwin, which he's probably a little disappointed about as he was in his contract year. But given the foot injury that Mahomes had and the fact that he was fleeing for his life, did that just take everything out of them?
He was pressured. It was a Super Bowl record, wasn't it? He was pressured for 29 of 59 dropbacks.
I mean, I think to come back to Aldrin's point in part, for me, you look at the game plan on the offensive and defensive side of the ball for Tampa Bay, and I can't remember a time where I've sat and watched a game where that game plan just worked as well and as effectively as it did. You know, we talked a week ago about all the things that had to happen for Tampa Bay to win that game, and every single one of them did. I mean, to your point, JB, I'm not sure Chris Godwin will be that disappointed when he walks away with a Super Bowl ring on his finger, you know what I mean? But let's start on the defensive side. You know, yes, they got pressure. So we talked about the importance of Jason Pierre-Paul, Sack Barrett. We talked about the importance of, you know, them being able to cover people like Tyreek Hill deep down the field. And all of that came together beautifully. We talked about Devin White being a big impact player and needing loads of energy to keep with Kelsey. And everything that we have said, you know, was obvious to four guys in the UK talking a few days before that game. Coming back to this point about Andy Reid or Spags or Bieniemy, all these people who are obviously working on the game plan on the Kansas City side of things. Well, where was that? I mean, if Mahomes has got an issue with his movement, then where's the run game or some kind of balance? I mean, that only seemed to really appear once. It kind of popped its head up in the first drive of the second half. And they actually put together a really nice drive, ended up with only 3 points for a field goal. The problem was that field goal was responded to by a brilliant touchdown drive by Tampa Bay that put the game away. On the offensive side of the ball for Tampa Bay, we had mentioned in last week's podcast about Tyrann Mathieu, and poor Tyrann Mathieu, you can see him following Brady's eyes on so many of those big Bucs plays where Brady's glances are just sending him left, sending him right. And it was just a case of, you know, all those big game players for Tampa Bay were balling, you know, Leonard Fournette, you know, Mike Evans, you know, absolutely having monster games. But in a world where, you know, we've talked about this being a copycat league, you know, and everyone wanting the next bright young quarterback like a Mahomes. Well, how about a copycat league that's now got a copy having the oldest head coach in the league, the oldest Super Bowl winning head coach, the oldest quarterback to win a Super. I mean, how do you follow that? This was all about Tom Brady, wasn't it? This was all about one guy that everybody believed in and everybody followed. And my God, did he save the best till last when it came to his performance on Sunday?
Brady is obviously an integral part of it. I think you're right to call out Todd Bowles, though. The game plan from the New York Giants when they beat the Buffalo Bills in the Super Bowl that Bill Belichick created as the defensive coordinator, I think is in the Hall of Fame. Todd Bowles' game plan, the execution and the adjustments that they made throughout that game, if not deserve to go in there, at the very least should be given as examples to every other defensive coordinator in the league as to what to do. Patrick Mahomes is the best quarterback in the league against the blitz. In the Super Bowl, he was 0 for 5 with an interception. That game plan took the strengths of the Chiefs and made them weaknesses. It didn't attack the weak points. It attacked the strong points and made them weaknesses. Jason Pierre-Paul or Vita Vea or Ndamukong Suh or Devin White or Levante David. The list of Bucs defensive players who made a splash was incredible. And part of me is kind of a bit shocked that Brady got the MVP vote, but I'm guessing that's because they just couldn't give it to the entire defense.
I mean, definitely worth mentioning Levante David, isn't it? I mean, he was really physical and had a great game. I mean, the weird thing is, you know, in preparation for our lovely podcast, I brought up the Super Bowl stats. And to give you an idea, some of the headline stats, obviously beyond the score. First downs, Kansas City 22, Tampa Bay Buccaneers 26. And obviously when you get into things like red zone stats, obviously the Chiefs got there 3 times, didn't get 7 points, had to settle for field goals and so on. But it really didn't feel that close to me watching along. If you'd have told me that the first down count was within 5 either way, I would never have believed you. Like I said, Mahomes being sacked, all of the, not only the drops, but the near misses as well. The amount of times when a scrambling Mahomes was, throwing balls that just came off the fingertips or were slightly out of reach of receivers. It just felt like a real meltdown. And it's odd really when you go through the stat lines that other than the score, which I think probably shows it to be just as one-sided as it was, it kind of looks a more competitive game. And like I say, watching along, I just never really felt that at all.
Your point about Todd Bowles and having a game plan and Kansas City not having a game plan is really spot on, because I know Phil talked about it last week when we were talking about the earlier Chiefs-Bucks game. And Phil made the comment that Bowles had made a great adjustment at halftime and limited Kansas to next to no points in the second half of that first game. Did Kansas not learn from that? Because effectively, Todd Bowles just rolled out his game plan from the second half of that first game and did it again. He kept his safeties high, took Tyreek Hill out of the game and got pressure up front. And it just felt like the Chiefs kind of forgot about that and just thought, oh, well, that first half was great, so we'll just do that again, and completely forget that Todd Bowles is, going to come out with his second half game plan like he did in that last game and make it really tough for Kansas. And they just didn't, like you said, they just didn't seem prepared for it, which was odd for a Super Bowl.
We didn't blitz a great deal. I think the majority of the time we were rushing 4. And with the other 7 dropping back, and that's to add extra protection for Hill and Kelsey, after we got torched in the first game. But it was different looks as well. It wasn't, it wasn't always rushing the linebackers and stuff like that. There was one play, I think it was a third down, where we did a corner blitz as well. It wasn't the same look every play. It wasn't the same look every couple of plays. He mixed it up, and I think he played the perfect game plan, Todd Bowles. And I also think actually that Byron Leftwich deserves a lot of credit for the offensive game plan as well. And he's coming for a lot of criticism. First play of every drive is a 1-yard run up the gut. Automatically, you're then looking to try and pass to get a lot of yardage from second down and going from there. And he's not always too highly in terms of his play calling this season. But, I don't think throughout the playoffs and certainly in the Super Bowl, I don't think that you can argue that he didn't call a great game. And I think him and Bowles, both really did well. And it's interesting, we talk about pressures. I said earlier, I think, didn't I? Mahomes was pressured on 29 of 59 dropbacks, which was a new Super Bowl record. But actually on the other side of the ball, Brady was pressured on only 4 of his 30 dropbacks, which is the best protection he's gotten in a Super Bowl. And if you think about how good and how highly that Patriots offensive line is rated, it shows you how good a job that Bucs offensive line did on Sunday.
I think that's so funny when you think if you're going to let Tom Brady have time in the pocket to pick his passes, then you're asking for trouble, aren't you? And particularly when you've got Gronk rolling, you've got Evans. Recipe for disaster if you're going to let him stand there and take time and pick his passes.
We said it on the night. I think Brady just took a 3-step drop and just stood there. And no one came anywhere near him. And you can't do that. With both of the Bucs victories in the Super Bowl, it's been the same. If you think back to the 2002 postseason, Bucs had lost to the Eagles in the season and this was having never won against the Eagles on the road. And at the end of it, John Gruden sort of said to the team, I've got it. I've got their blitzes. I've got their looks. I know what they're going to do. We will come back here and we will win. And sure enough, in the playoffs, they went back to play the Eagles and they won. It was the same thing this season. I think the first game, the regular season game, taught the Bucs staff what they needed to do to beat the Chiefs. And then they executed and did everything that they had learnt. There was a drop Kelsey had in the third quarter. The camera sort of stayed with him as he got back up to his feet, and you could see it across so many of the Chiefs players when it showed them that it got to the third quarter and none of them looked like they believed they could win.
I'm glad you brought up the last, our only other Super Bowl win, Super Bowl 37, because interestingly enough, the winning margin on Sunday was the biggest winning margin since Super Bowl 37 when we shut down the Raiders. The Bucs only deal in Super Bowl blowouts. They're undefeated in Super Bowls, 2-0 as well. So if you want the Club Dub Buccaneers stats podcast from the Super Bowl, we'll release a special edition 1 hour long episode next week on that.
I think that might end up on Rob's cutting room floor.
What I would say is, people have talked about the defense from that year, and arguably as one of the best defenses ever. And how does this year's defense compare? Well, if you look at that, one of the reasons we performed so well against the Raiders in Super Bowl 37 is because they were still running the same plays that Gruden set up when he was there. So Gruden could play quarterback for the scout team and show all the plays that were going to happen. And they did happen. They were still happening with exactly the same calls as when Gruden was coached there. If you compare against this year's team, it was playing against the team who torched us in the regular season and early on and until we made those adjustments. So I'd arguably say this performance was even better than the Super Bowl 37 defensive performance, purely because you're not playing a team whose playbook inside out. It was absolutely fantastic. For me to watch and for all Bucs fans to watch. It was almost unbelievable. I know we talked about it, and last week we were talking about head and heart and all that kind of stuff. But I thought we could win, but never in a million years did I think that we'd keep them to no touchdowns and only 3 field goals. It was amazing.
There could yet be things to come out of this whole Kansas City defeat that we haven't heard yet. I mean, I've talked about the coaches and game planning. Obviously, it requires that the players go out and execute that game plan. But I just can't believe the drop-off from the Buffalo Bills game, where the game plan was near perfect to what we saw in the Super Bowl. So, yeah, a real pity because, as much as I'm thrilled they won for you, Phil, and for all Bucs fans, I do feel that kind of something has robbed us of what had all the makings of a classic, and I think, bar the winning margin, a couple of those stat lines that'll, put it firmly in Super Bowl history, it didn't really have that feel of, I don't know, the game I felt that we were promised, the game I thought that we were going to experience on Sunday.
I think Brady, was the MVP and was the easy choice for the MVP because of the story, but for me, I voted for Gronk. I think he had an amazing performance with the 2 touchdowns. He had the catch before the Fournette touchdown to set up the good field position there as well. His blocking was amazing. I think he played really well. Fournette, who probably his biggest 4 games of the season in the 4 playoff games. So, what was it? Playoff Lenny, then Super Bowl Lenny, and now he's Lombardi Lenny. So Suckup as well. Ryan Suckup, the first Mr. Irrelevant to win the Super Bowl. Going back to something Rob mentioned last week, and Rob mentioned the backflip. And he could see that being an America's game moment. And it wasn't actually the backflip, but you can tell that something was remembered from that first game. And it was the peace sign that Tyreek Hill threw up as he ran past Antoine Winfield Jr. to score that touchdown. And as soon as Antoine Winfield breaks up that 4th down pass in the 4th quarter, he throws up the peace sign back to Hill. And I think you're absolutely right. When he did that in that first game, they've taken that to heart.
Part of that is really good GM work. Bringing in those players, every point scored in that game was by players that weren't on the roster last year. They're all veteran free agents that were all picked up. There's only so much that gets you, and really good draft work is another massive part of that. Vita Vea was an absolute mauler. White, Winfield Jr., these are all really high draft picks that performed exactly how you want them to, and they're coming in at a nice friendly cap number so that you can get those 4 other guys that make the big plays. So
Wirfs as well, obviously our first round pick from this year, has been lights out all season.
That last point on free agency pickups, if there is a fairy tale to come out of the Buccaneers, and fairy tale's probably the wrong phrase, who on earth thought Antonio Brown would be putting a Super Bowl ring on, a year ago?
I think if you think back to the start of last season, the guy couldn't even put cleats on, let alone now putting a Super Bowl ring on. I think that is ridiculous.
His story is as weird, wild and wonderful as it's always been, but great Super Bowl performance from a player who maybe has half a chance of getting back to being considered a genuine top tier talent. I mean, we're not talking about a WR1 here, are we? We're talking about one of the top 3 or 4 guys in the league for a number of years when he was a Steeler. Let's hope he keeps himself moving in an upward direction because he's an exciting player to watch.
We can talk about the Super Bowl as well without mentioning the boat Super Bowl parade yesterday. Like, what an absolute laugh that looked like. Incredible. You can see why, I don't know if you've seen any of the picture comparisons of Super Bowl parades in New England versus Super Bowl parades in Florida, but I think you can see why Brady and Gronk probably are enjoying it a little bit more now than they did back then. You know, what a crazy day that looked like. Throwing the Lombardi trophy from boat to boat, like absolutely incredible. What, you know, how amazing would that have been to be there?
What do you mean? Do you not think Bill Belichick loves a party? I mean, I can imagine Bill Belichick winning a Super Bowl and then making them all go to the film room and watch tape. Only other last point that I want to make, and it's just one that we've talked about a little internally previously, is just on that free agent market. And I think the way Jason Light has built the team was really good. The only big challenge they've got now is trying to keep that team together. We talked about Antonio Brown, Leonard Fournette. They're on the free agent market now, and you know they're gonna command a fee. Certainly, we've seen from Brown that he wants to get paid. That's what he did when he left the Steelers, and you know it's been a bit choppy. But I think, like we said, if he's now shown himself that he can get a solid season in, he can perform well, and he can still perform at a high level. So he's going to command money. You've got Levante David, who's a free agent. There's an awful lot of pieces there that they've got to try and keep around, and in a year where the cap is lower than before and you've got a lot of now Super Bowl winning players that are going to command a lot of attention from teams like the Jags and the Jets that are going to have a lot of cap room and a lot of ambitious coaches that want to put players into positions and fill some gaps. Tom Brady is a good remedy to that. Having Tom around, showing that they can win a Super Bowl is certainly going to be alluring to some of those players that might take a smaller number to stick around. But I just think there's a hell of a lot of players. You're not talking 1 or 2 pieces here. You're talking big pieces of offense and big pieces of defense and kind of stalwarts of the team almost in some cases that, like Levante David's 31. And I know he said, Tampa's his team and he'd love to stick around. He wants to win another, but equally he's got a family to support. He's got a ring on his finger and he has a conversation with his agent. It probably won't be as friendly and amenable as it might be when he's talking to the media the day after winning a Super Bowl. So that's the only takeaway for me.
Levante David, off the back of a great Super Bowl performance, does have the feel of the kind of player who gets overpaid, doesn't he? That player who gets one big deal too many to see out a career. The only thing, and I'm going to now very foolishly just refer directly to the Cardinals, who have no right to be mentioned when we're talking about Super Bowl winning and playoff football more generally. There was a great interview with Cliff Kingsbury today on the Arizona Cardinals website, and he was talking about all of Arizona's impending free agents. So we've got Patrick Peterson, Kenyon Drake, who was tagged last year, and so on and so forth. And basically Cliff Kingsbury's response was, I feel sorry for any player who's going to be a free agent this summer because the money just isn't there, and you're right, there are exceptions, and like the Jets, like the Jags and so on. But I mean, the one maybe saving grace out there for, Buccaneers and these free agents on the horizon is, I don't think anyone really, bar 1 or 2 teams, are going to be going out there and spending big. I don't think anybody is going to be using tag, because when you're taking an average of, the top 5 best paid players at any position, no one's going to be wanting to carry that on their cap for 2021. So who knows? I mean, I was thinking by this point, we even talked about it, muted it last week, didn't we? We might do some free agent chat on this podcast this week. I think until that cap figure is announced, the free agent market could look very, very quiet for a good while yet. But, maybe that is the stroke of luck that gives Brady, what would it be, his 8th Super Bowl before he's 45? Who knows where we'll be in 12 months.
Just one final word. I know I said that before.
I didn't think for a minute that you would have the final word on the Tampa Super Bowl.
Have you written something down, Phil?
I want to make a point of the fact that this is now the 4th time you've spoken after saying this is the last thing I'm going to say.
Also, only other thing I would call out is when we were on a call on the Super Bowl night and we were all said, we're really happy for Phil. It's really good that his team's won. but my goodness, is he going to be insufferable? And here you are, proving us 100% right. Well done.
Someone tweeted 6th of August 2020. Not sure why anyone's excited about two has-beens now playing for one of the worst football franchises. And I don't know if he bookmarked it or saved it or what happened. But on Monday, Jason Light just replied to that and said, this didn't age well.
So, gents, with the Super Bowl weekend out the way, it is obviously also the weekend where the NFL honours occur on the famous Saturday night before. And before we round up, I just wanted to go around our virtual room to add on this particularly stellar. I mean, I suppose Peyton Manning being in it makes it stellar all on its own, really, doesn't it? But the particularly stellar class that we have this year. And Aldrin, before we see Phil talk about former Tampa Bay Buccaneers that made the list,
I think you hit the nail on the head. Peyton Manning was obviously, I think I read something earlier where they said a Colts beat writer only spent 18 words extolling why Peyton Manning should make it into the Hall of Fame. And I think, was there any point even voting? It was so obvious that he was going to make it in first ballot. The guy revolutionized football in Indy, and that's the only way to say it. It was when he came in from college, I know we've talked about it in the past, and, players that come through the college system and are absolute locks in the NFL. And I think we've been fortunate that we probably had two of those in our franchise, in Peyton Manning and then Andrew Luck, both coming out of college, elite at the position, and have walked into the NFL and absolutely taken it in their stride and turned it on its head. And, obviously we won a Super Bowl with him, but just the way that he drove the franchise forward, then obviously had his injury and winning comeback player of the year. The guy's had so many passing records, touchdown records over the course of his career, obviously. Yeah, my goodness, what a career. I couldn't think of anybody that belongs in the Hall of Fame more. You can't meet a nicer guy, a smarter quarterback. And I think, if he wants to go into coaching, he'd walk into it and take the league by storm, because he was a coach and a general on the field anyway. So
I think one of the things that came out when Brett Favre came up for candidacy of being enshrined in the Hall of Fame was that the discussion as to whether he should go in took less than 10 seconds. I would imagine that the conversation as to whether Peyton Manning went into the Hall of Fame went something like, all right, everybody in on this? From my point of view, yeah, I think Peyton Manning going in, Charles Woodson going in, Megatron going in, I think are all very well deserved. But for me, it was guys like Tom Flores finally going into the Hall of Fame. Alan Faneca, him after years of candidacy and kind of being overlooked. It's the NFL in the last couple of seasons have done quite a good job with the Hall of Fame of making sure that people who deserve to be recognized are going in. There was a lot of that last year for the 100th season when people were added in and they extended the class size to be able to fit people like Jimmy Johnson and Bill Cowher, people who've not been successful previously. And I think it's just good to see deserving candidates finally get their shot.
I'd include John Lynch in that as well, and obviously I'm biased as a Buccaneers fan, and I think he's deserving of the Hall of Fame. I wouldn't have been disappointed to have seen Rondé Barber get in, maybe in place of John Lynch this year, but, it's nice to see John Lynch in there. Charles Woodson was obviously going to get in. I was probably surprised, if we're talking about surprise, I was probably surprised to see Calvin Johnson get in there as a first ballot. I mean, I know you can argue that he could be in there, but for me, I wasn't necessarily sure that they would go that way, given some of the people that they've snubbed in the past. So that was good to see.
I just think on the Megatron point, you forget, though, it's so easy to forget that for 2 or 3 seasons, that guy was unplayable. He was the face of the NFL. He was the best receiver. The number of yards he put up was insane, and it's just easy to forget because he had a short career, and obviously with the Hall of Fame sometimes they look less favorably on that, and those players often get in but not necessarily first ballot. But I think Calvin Johnson, the way he played the game, he was top tier in a Lions team that was pretty bang average at best, and he was the player of the league. He had a rule named after him for, one of his dubious catches. So I don't think, for me, that wasn't a surprise. I just think he was such a face and so important for the receiver position that he kind of felt like a natural lock, really, above some of the other receivers that admittedly had great careers. But, you know, some of those, you might win a Super Bowl, but unless you're the guy of the NFL, then I don't think you carry quite as much weight as Calvin Johnson does.
Antonio Brown, let's take him, as we've spoken about him earlier. He's got a similar stat line to Calvin Johnson, if not better in some categories. He now has a Super Bowl. So, you know, then do you argue, well, if Calvin Johnson is a first ballot Hall of Famer, is Antonio Brown a Hall of Famer? And I know there's a lot of other issues that go alongside that, but it's, you know, it's one of those ones that I think then opens up to...
I think your point around that is interesting, but it's flawed and wrong, really. You're talking about Antonio Brown on a Steelers team that was sort of running backed by Le'Veon Bell when he was at the height of his powers. It was quarterbacked by Ben Roethlisberger, who was incredibly good at distributing the ball. You compare Megatron to Julio Jones. Or Julio Jones has been on Falcons teams that have not always performed as well as they should, but has always been productive. You look at Calvin Johnson and he has been playing for the Detroit Lions, and the Detroit Lions have not been a very good football team for decades. Matthew Stafford aside, because I still rate him higher than other people on this podcast, you knew where the ball was going in Detroit. It wasn't going to the running game. It wasn't going to any of the tight ends. It was going to Megatron. And despite the fact that teams knew that was exactly what was going to happen, they still couldn't stop it.
But Calvin Johnson, I mean, when we were talking about, you know, Antonio Brown and Calvin Johnson's stat lines and records, I'll agree on one part of that point, that I think there was a time where Antonio Brown was the best wide receiver in football. And I think there was probably a slightly longer time when Calvin Johnson was the best receiver in football. But looking at stat lines and records, and when we think about the way the league has progressed in the last few years to be, you know, a really offensive heavy league, I'm just going to bring up all of the active NFL records that Calvin Johnson still holds to this day. Most receiving yards in a single season, set that in 2012, 1,964. Seasons with 1,600 plus yards receiving, he's had 2 of those, which ties in with Marvin Harrison, Torrey Holt, Antonio Brown, and Julio Jones. Most consecutive games with at least 100 yards receiving, 8, tied with Adam Thielen. Most consecutive games with at least 10 receptions he holds on his own, that's 4. Most 100 yards receiving games in a single season, 11, tied with Michael Irvin. I mean, and I could go on. Most receiving yards in a 5-game span, 6-game span, single game in regulation, he holds that record, 329. And the only thing for me is, you know, the Hall of Fame is made for people like Calvin Johnson, because as you just said, JB, this is a guy who holds all of those records and has alongside those records 2 postseason appearances. You know, ultimately, if it isn't for, you know, things like the Hall of Fame, you know, who gives, you know, a player like Calvin Johnson the recognition he deserves for possibly being, you know, the best receiver to play the game, you know, in a different team, different supporting cast. I mean, I'd probably put Larry Fitzgerald, again, you might call me biased, in that bracket, that you look at their careers and think, well, could it have been different if they wouldn't have found themselves on those teams at those times? But yeah, I think Calvin Johnson is an absolute no-brainer for a first ballot Hall of Famer, and many congrats to him and to the rest of the class of 2021.
While we're on the award subject, moving away from the Hall of Fame, the one I wanted to touch on was the comeback player of the year, which was not unanimous, which I cannot believe. Alex Smith coming back from nearly losing his leg, you know, taking a team to the playoffs. His 3rd play, I think it was, coming back from his injury, having the defensive player of the year jump on his back and hang off him, and everybody hold their breath, you know, at that moment. Doesn't get 1 vote from a guy who votes for Ben Roethlisberger.
This is also, remember, an award panel that has included someone voting Bobby Wagner MVP. And when you just get into nominating teams in general, remember that every time he has voted for his all-pro team, Troy Aikman has never voted for a fullback. Just doesn't see the point.
Is that fact?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure, yeah.
The only other ones that I wanted to touch on was Aaron Rodgers was a deserving MVP. I think he was phenomenal throughout the season. Aaron Donald, Defensive Player of the Year again. What is that? His third in a row. James is going to shake his head, and I'm imagining TJ Watt or Bud Dupree or literally any of the Steelers probably get a mention for those really solid first 5 games of the season before we forgot who they were. Personally, I do think Aaron Donald deserves it. The guy gets triple covered every week and still manages to make big plays. So I think it's tough to rule him out for just the player that he is. Offensive Rookie of the Year, then Herbert. I think that was an interesting one because obviously Justin Jefferson was really highly touted, but when the voting came through, it was pretty one-sided towards Herbert, and Justin Jefferson was a very distant second, if we're honest. But I don't think you can begrudge that. Quarterbacks often get the rub of the green. Obviously, the difference between the two of them is that Justin Jefferson started week 1 and Justin Herbert came in week 3, starting a game that he didn't know he was even going to be really properly dressed for up to about an hour before the game. So I think you've got to give him a hell of a lot of credit the way he came in and single-handedly rebuilt that franchise. I think he's created some excitement there. So that's a no-brainer for me. And Derrick Henry winning Offensive Player of the Year again, when you have a monster season like he had. I know they certainly enjoyed having a final game against the Texans to have him steamroll his way into a 2,000-yard season, but the last 2 years that guy has been an absolute unstoppable freight train, hasn't he? I certainly wouldn't vote against him just in case he saw who I voted for.
I think for me, the most controversial point is probably Aaron Donald, and he's an absolute monster, and I think he is one of the top defensive players in the league. But for me, wasn't Defensive Player of the Year this season. I think TJ Watt was robbed of that. You know, if you look at TJ Watt's stat line compared to Aaron Donald, you know, he hasn't openly come out and said anything, but you know, his brother JJ Watt obviously tweeted almost on his behalf to say, you know, respect to Aaron Donald, absolutely love the guy, but my brother was robbed here. And I think that's fair. You know, arguably you could have said TJ Watt should have won it last year. Aaron Donald got the nod. This year, I think he had an even stronger case to win it, and Aaron Donald got it again. So, you know, sometimes I think you wonder what some of these people are voting based on.
I do think if you purely look at stats, then kind of like we talked about with Calvin Johnson, you lose some of the je ne sais quoi of that player. I'm waiting for the grief for using the word je ne sais quoi.
What?
Was that a hit for Kylie Minogue? It's maybe a bit early for Herbert and Jefferson to start making those calls. But I think we're talking about names that are all, you know, in however many years' time going to be first ballot Hall of Famers themselves, aren't they? I think Rodgers is going to be straight in. I think Donald is going to be straight in. I think Henry all of a sudden, you know, the last 3 years he's had makes him an absolute dead cert to be a first ballot Hall of Famer as well. Coming to a close now with our Super Bowl review show. I mean, looking back on a season that has provided so much entertainment in a year where I was just waiting for COVID to take over and I was waiting for weeks or months to be lost. Isn't it lovely that we can kind of look at these, you know, of the year type awards and just look back over what a great year we've had with so many teams, you know, creating so many interesting narratives around the NFL. Join us again next week where we'll bring you all the NFL news and updates, hopefully some free agency discussion to be had, and maybe even some news on the salary cap by then. But thank you ever so much for listening, everybody, and we'll catch you again in 7 days' time.
Go Bucks!
This is amazing. Woo!
Remember to subscribe and be cool. Tell your friends.
The game is over. The game is over.
I am currently on 15 references from Phil of we/us in reference to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. But be sure to hit us up on Twitter with what your count is.
If you're mentioning kickers, you know you've just gone through every stat you could
Bradley
find.
Pinion. Is there a Jason Light tweet calendar?
Alan Fanasia. Can't pronounce that.
Faneca.
Faneca. That's what I'm trying to say.